33.
"Oh, Mr. Dannington,"
the wasted, white-skinned figure called out. Yes, Mr. Mosconi, was there something else?
"As a matter of fact, there is,"
Mosconi replied. He pulled out a chair and motioned for the man to sit down. The man did as beckoned.
"I have a few other things I would like to discuss with you off the record, if that is all right with you."
Sure thing, Mr. Mosconi. When would you like to schedule an interview?
"Why, right now, if possible. We could have a bit of breakfast as well, if you're hungry."
Mosconi motioned for one of his brethren. Well, I do have a plane to catch, so how long are we looking at? Mosconi let out a quiet, deep-throated chuckle. Chris Dannington frowned at the sound.
"It won't take long at all, Mr. Dannington. So, is it a date then?"
Something in his gut warned Dannington away, but any little inroad to the new church he could weasel might do wonders for his career. Greed trumped instinct. Yeah, sure, why not? This place got some good cooks?
"That it does,"
Mosconi breathed.
"You poor reporters. Always on the go, with never any time to enjoy a fine meal. I wonder how you stay healthy with your schedule."
That's not so bad, really. You get used to it. The jet lag is the worst. Quite a bit of a time change for me, Mr. Mosconi.
"I imagine so, Chris. May I call you Chris? I grow tired of the formalities. Besides, a new age is upon us. Perhaps we can begin to rewrite some proprieties."
Dannington shrugged his consent, beginning to relax. A yawn escaped him, and he straightened. Excuse me. That last flight in really threw me off my clock, if you know what I mean.
"No need to worry, Chris. No need at all."
So, what do you serve for breakfast in this joint? Dannington asked, gazing around at the splendid furnishings and breathing in the sense of timelessness. At the thought of food, his stomach rumbled.
"Anything you like, anything at all."
One of the brethren arrived at the table. Dannington looked at the man, younger than Mosconi, but wasted and white-skinned just the same. Dannington didn't like the looks of these two. Something about the change Mosconi referred to didn't sit right with him. He wasn't too sure about the wrath of God story. He wasn't too sure about anything. But here he was, on the verge of an exclusive interview with the leader of the new church. Maybe the whole story was about to come out. Maybe it was about to be Chris Dannington's story.
"Frederico,"
the Mosconi thing rasped.
"Mr. Dannington will join me for breakfast. Serve him well, please. He must be famished."
Mosconi smiled. The white thing called Frederico smiled back.
"Very well, Alberto. He is in good hands."
Dannington noticed the look traded between the two, but he was distracted by his crew. Finished packing up their film equipment and ready to hit the road, they gathered at the doors, turning expectant eyes to him. "All set, Mr. Dannington," Roger, the crew leader, called to him. "Everything's packed." Slight change of plans. I've got a short meeting with Mr. Mosconi here. Go on without me, and I'll just catch another flight later in the day." The short man's face squirmed. "You sure that's a good idea? We got to be in Jerusalem tomorrow afternoon, you know. If you're not on time, Pat's going to blow his top."
"He will be there,"
Mosconi interrupted.
"as will I and a few of my brethren."
"Mr. Mosconi, with all respect, I think I know what's best for my crew," Roger replied, drawing himself up to his full, unimpressive height. "Roger, don't be so—" The Mosconi thing's brow furled, and Dannington froze in mid-sentence. Cold, black eyes bored past him, piercing into Roger like ice chisels. Roger's mouth dropped open, and the short man suddenly looked ill. Dannington saw the rash of goosebumps spreading over Roger's arms, and the bead of sweat that sprang out on Roger's forehead.
"You do not need to worry about Mr. Dannington. We will take the best of care of your reporter. You, though, you might wish to adhere to your schedule before I become stressed with your presence."
The Mosconi thing gazed around the room, coal black eyes, flat and empty.
"That is not a side of me you wish to see,"
it rasped. It turned back to Roger.
"Do we understand each other?"
"Yes," Roger whispered, and Dannington saw his trembling. The white, wasted figure smiled.
"Good. Now run along. Don't miss your flight on our behalf."
Okay, Roger managed. He stirred. His eyes widened, and he sneaked a glance downward. Dannington followed his eyes and saw the wet spot spreading across the short man's groin. "Roger," Dannington cried. "What the hell, man? Go clean yourself up." I don't know," Roger stammered, shrinking from the eyes of his crew. "Just go, for God's sake. I'll see you in Jerusalem, okay?" Roger fled without a look back. Wide-eyed and ashen-faced, the rest of the crew pulled themselves together, picked up their equipment, and followed. Shaking, rattled, Dannington turned back to the grinning, wasted white thing in the velvet chair. "Mr. Mosconi, I am so sorry for my colleague's behavior. I don't know what could have possibly come over—"
"It is inconsequential,"
the Mosconi thing said, and Dannington's mouth snapped shut.
"Never mind the others. It is time for you and I now."
Dannington blinked, the unease rolling itself into a ball in his stomach. "What is it you wanted to talk to me about, Mr. Mosconi?" The white-waisted figure smiled and leaned back in his chair. The food was good. Dannington loosened his belt and accepted another helping, watching as Mosconi signed a mountain of paperwork. Mosconi offered little conversation while his guest wolfed down plate after plate of proffered breakfast foods, and Dannington was keenly aware that his host did not touch a single bite for himself. When he finally finished, pushing away his last plate with a huge sigh of satisfaction, he gestured toward Mosconi's pile of paperwork. "Change calls for a lot of signatures, don't it?" The Mosconi thing grinned up from its task.
"Indeed. And how will we ever progress without a change?"
Dannington saw a crinkle of disgust cross the wasted, white face.
"I grew sicker with the old ways. I have full faith in our new leader to see us through to real change, to actualization. Something our world so desperately needs, don't you agree?"
Dannington nodded, fiddling with the heavy, ornate silver fork at his plate setting. "We do need change, Mr. Mosconi, and I'd love to see Samuel pull it off." He wiped at his mouth with a thick linen napkin and leaned back with his hands laced over his stomach. "That was exquisite. No lie, the cooks here are fabulous. Aren't you going to eat?"
"I took my breakfast just before this morning's announcement. Have you had enough? I do not wish to let my guest hunger."
The white thing smiled. Dannington thought for sure a few teeth in Mosconi's mouth had grown longer than the others. He blinked and rubbed his eyes. Another yawn overtook him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mosconi. I'm just—"
"There is no need to apologize, Chris."
I feel awfully rude, sitting here barely able to hold my eyes open in the company of, an esteemed leader such as yourself." Dannington flushed, feeling suddenly too warm. His head swam. For a moment he thought he might swoon out of his chair.
"It's quite all right, I assure you. I have just a few more signatures here, and then you and I may discuss a few matters."
The Mosconi thing bowed its head back to its remaining paperwork, and Dannington definitely saw teeth poking between those wasted lips, sharp teeth that hung low like canine fangs. Dannington blinked, leaning forward for a better look. Mosconi pressed his lips together, scratched a few more scribbles on the last document, and shoved the whole pile aside.
"There,"
he said, coal-black eyes turning up to meet Dannington's curious stare.
"All done."
Dannington cleared his throat. "Maybe we can get on with the interview? I don't mean to rush you, Mr. Mosconi, but—" He yawned again. He couldn't help it, and he laughed a little. Damn, he was tired.
"We will get to it,"
the wasted white thing said. Its brows furrowed again. "Is something wrong, Mr. Mosconi?" The white figure stared over his head.
"Actually, something has troubled me over the past 2 days, Chris. May I share my thoughts with you? Or perhaps you will have feedback to share."
Dannington sat back, floored by the invitation. Alberto Mosconi, second in command over the cancelled-out Catholic Church, was about to confide in him, maybe even ask him for advice. He could already hear his new nightly intro playing out to the network jingle in his head. "Now we bring you Chris Dannington, trusted media advisor to the leader of the new church." Dannington yawned again and forced his eyes to focus. "Of course, Mr. Mosconi. I would be honored to hear what's on your mind. and I only hope I can offer a perspective worthy of someone of your stature."
"The man does know how to grovel,"
Mosconi thought. He chuckled, rising from his chair, gazing down at the idiot TV reporter. Mosconi savored the hot aroma of the man's blood, cocking his head to appreciate the primal drumbeat of the man's pulse. He'd restrained himself, barely, while Dannington feasted, goading his own hunger with the sight of the others feeding. Now he wanted to see the man squirm.
"I believe there is a monster among us, Chris,"
Mosconi said quietly, staring down into the reporter's widening eyes.
"A monster of the worst kind, one with no remorse, one that will do anything to sate its hunger."
Dannington blinked. Mosconi saw the man's struggle to lift his lids, and he smiled. "Well, in politics there are always monsters, Mr. Mosconi," Dannington replied, trying to sound sage. "Change or no change, I'm afraid the monsters are here to stay."
"You have no idea,"
Mosconi thought, wordless, staring down at the stupid little man. Dannington shifted under his gaze, squirming on the edge of his seat like a schoolboy excited to be called upon in class. "Did you, have someone particular in mind? I mean, rest assured, our conversation will remain totally off the record, as you requested." Mosconi laughed. The sound came out in a dry rasp. He cleared his throat, paused, then spoke again.
"There are dirty, worthless pigs in politics. I am talking about a monster, Chris, a real monster."
Dannington sat back in his chair, elbows on the edge of the massive table. He chuckled. Seeing Mosconi's unmoving expression, he frowned. His eyes ticked back and forth between Mosconi's, seeking some sign of jest. "A real monster," Dannington repeated, blinking heavily against the threat of a new yawn. "Like the horror movie kind?"
"Oh, yes!"
Mosconi cried, and he let out a shriek of laughter that drove Dannington back in his chair.
"The most terrible kind, one like those of old."
His anticipation, his hunger, rushed in on him like a tidal wave at its breaking point. Dannington started, his heartbeat pounding in double time. Mosconi could hear it, maddening and alluring. Oh, and the smell, the scent of fear on his prey drew him in, almost irresistible. Looming over the idiot reporter, Mosconi wet his lips in eagerness. Dannington stared up at him, blinking and dull and distantly afraid, trying to recover his composure. "Mr. Mosconi, there are no such things as monsters." Dannington managed another short laugh. Mosconi inhaled a screech of air, baring his teeth, and Dannington stopped laughing. The white-skinned, wasted old man turned away, doubling over on himself, and Dannington started to reach out, then stopped short. The laugh issuing from the Mosconi thing croaked out 2 octaves lower than before, dry as leaves in October. Dannington's eyes watered. He blinked, and even now, even with his heart tap-dancing away like a dervish, he struggled against another yawn. Back to him, hunched over its croaking laughter, the white thing spoke.
"But there are, my son. Don't you see?"
"Mr. Mosconi," Dannington whispered, "is this some kind of joke?" Mosconi straightened suddenly, and he gained a full foot of height. He swept his hands to the sides, and Dannington saw the gnarled, twisted fingers sprout hideously thick nails, hooked claws that could peel wood. The wasted, white-skinned figure threw back its head and uttered that inward, inhaled shriek again. Dannington swallowed. He heard the gulp in his throat.
"No, Chris,"
the Mosconi thing rasped, hulking and expanding before his eyes.
"It is no joke."
Dannington cleared his throat, and his sanity excused itself. "Well, Mr. Mosconi, I've really got to be going now. Breakfast was excellent, and I thank you for it." He stood up, draping his napkin over his plate with shaking hands. His voice cracking in near hysterics, he babbled on. "I appreciate your hospitality, and I assure you there are no monsters, and I promise you that when I find out who is in on this load of bullshit, you will all be sorry." The Mosconi thing kept its back to him. It was still enlarging, its wasted figure buckling and contorting as it stretched higher.
"But you're wrong, Chris."
Its chuckling, rasping voice froze his blood.
"There are monsters, the most terrible kind, like those of old."
Dannington's head swam again. Swaying on his feet, he yawned, helpless to stop it. He struggled to push himself away from the massive wooden table and the growing, twisting impossibility in Mosconi's red robes. Forcing his eyes to stay open, Dannington felt implacable, invisible hands reaching out, dragging at his body and reeling him in.
"Like me."
Dannington almost had a chance to scream before it turned on him. He glimpsed a blur of white flesh and red robe. Black orbs bored into him. An enormous elongated maw came down on him in a flash. The creature took him to the marble floor, crushing him, its stretched and leering lips enveloping his throat. Before he could hitch in a breath, the fangs bit down. Dannington's eyes fluttered. The invisible hands were at him again, pulling him downward. He was so tired. The creature drained him in moments, and the hands dragged him away, his strength ebbing. The overwhelming exhaustion suffocated his consciousness, and he couldn't even resist.